Okay, well, this is video number two of two videos for chapter six. So if you follow along with me, hopefully we can get this done quick. So, country risk assessments, that's a very important ingredient in your business planning process. In our last class last week, we talked about where you can find this information. The reason why it's so important and valuable is that it helps you evaluate the country you're considering doing business in to ensure that it's a safe place to invest and to take your employees. The last thing you want to do is invest in a country where you might get killed or you might lose your investment. So one of the resources that you can access is called CoFace. So we're going to take a look at that real quick. I'll show you a little bit about this website. If you go to CoFace, www.coface.com, and you take a look at the Economic Studies tab, you'll see down at the bottom, I'll move down here relatively slowly, there's this area called the Country Risk Assessment. And you can choose a country. I'll go ahead and choose Afghanistan. And you can see that there's an 8-level ranking of risk. It starts at A1 and it moves down to E. So A1 is the best, safest country to do business in, and E would be the least safest. So let's take a look at Afghanistan just for fun. And I would recommend that you do this for your countries. You can see that Afghanistan is a country risk assessment of E and a business climate of E. I would definitely not consider doing business in Afghanistan at this point. It looks like it's a very unhealthy place to do business. Why? Because it has an unstable geopolitical situation, widespread corruption, very heavy reliance on grants, fragile banking system, and a heavy reliance on the agricultural section. And if I want to read more about why they have come to this conclusion, I can read more about that on this report. You can run these for virtually any country in the world on CoFace. So when you're evaluating your countries, please take the time to make sure it's a safe place for you to do business. So let's take a look at the types of risks that you may run into. There are political risks, there are economic and financial risks, and there are legal risks. And you should be aware of all of these. You've seen in the previous video what economic and financial risks look like with high inflation and dangerous wars and revolutions, high levels of terrorism for political risks, and then if there are basically an unfriendly business environment, there could be high taxes, there could be high tariffs. You've got issues with quotas, labor permits. We need to be careful where we do business in, what country we do business in. Companies can run country risk assessments on their own, and they can basically hire out or pay for specialty country risk assessments to be run. But several organizations also do these for you: Euromoney, Stratfor, Moody's Investor Service, just to name a few. They're available. They cost a lot of money to do specialty type analyses, but many companies do them, and they're very valuable if you're expanding in a foreign market. Let's talk a little bit about trade restrictions. Trade restrictions are restrictions on trade, pretty straightforward. They're restrictions that countries create to limit the amount of trade that flows into them. And there's justifiable and non-justifiable reasons for trade restrictions. These are all arguments here that people have used in the past for the reasons why we have trade restrictions or limitations, some limitation that stops product from flowing into our country. National defense is a justifiable argument. We need to protect industries. We've talked about this already. We need to protect industries that are vital to our national security. The steel industry, for instance, automotive industries, machine and mechanical industries, educational industries, um, chemical industries. These are very important industries for our national security, and they've been placed in a high priority and a position where we've decided as a country to protect them. And therefore, there's lots of methods we use to protect them. And, it can be justified, I think. Sanctions to punish offending nations. There are two nations that you are or should be familiar with that have been exposed to sanctions in the recent past and are currently under sanctions. One is Iran. And based on what's happened with Iran, one would argue that sanctions have been effective because they have stopped, at least for now, their nuclear ambitions and opened up their nuclear program to evaluation on a regular basis. Another country that's under sanctions is North Korea. And one could argue that's been completely the opposite outcome. North Korea has not responded well to sanctions, and they have the tightest sanctions on the planet right now. Very little trade is being done with them, and they still are refusing to give up their nuclear ambitions. So it's a mixed bag for sanctions and justifying sanctions and trade restrictions. Protecting infant or dying industries. This is a very important position and argument that's been made in the past, and justifiably so. When there are new industries that countries are trying to encourage to grow, they need to protect those industries from harm from other outside competitors. And it is justified at times to protect an infant industry. A dying industry, that might be another question. Do you protect a dying industry? I think in our competitive environment here in the United States, our argument would be, well, is it important for our national security? Then yes. If it is not important for our national security and it just relates to jobs, then I think our argument would be no. So, there are good reasons and bad reasons. It's kind of hard to decide one way or the other without looking at the specifics. Protecting domestic jobs. This particular administration, the United States presidency right now, would argue that we need to protect domestic jobs from cheap foreign labor. And the problem with that, of course, is you can't ultimately always protect domestic jobs from cheap foreign labor in a global market because, unfortunately, your companies in your country still have to compete overseas in other markets. Therefore, they're going to, whether you like it or not, attempt to find the cheapest cost resource because they have to compete in other markets, not just the local market. So it's really hard to justify that position. Although it sounds good, it doesn't really play out very well from an international standpoint. Dumping. This is another reason why we've created situations where we protected our markets, especially with predatory markets. That's when you intentionally put product in a market, you import product into a market or export product into a market in order to force the country's producers out of business. And one would argue that that is a justifiable reason for protecting your market. Let me give you an example. I don't know if China was using predatory dumping, but certainly the argument was that China was dumping steel in the United States market. And during the course of the last candidacy for president, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton argued in favor of getting tough with China. So let's see that argument here. Perhaps you'll remember this conversation. if you watched any of the
If
debates.
they cut and run, we're going to make them pay a price. You know, one of the biggest and most important battles is over steel. China and other countries, but primarily China, have been dumping artificially cheap steel into our markets to gain an unfair advantage. We are going to use every tool we possibly can against China for their illegal actions. I'm going to appoint a trade prosecutor reporting directly to me in the White House who will look for every possible way to prevent them from continuing this behavior. And I will have the federal government join with the trades and businesses in bringing trade cases against China. We're not going to wait for a union or a business to do it. We're going to join forces. We're going to do it together. We're going to go after the Chinese.
So as you can see, um, that particular argument definitely you know, came up in the last presidential election, and there was some justifiable reason for that. In fact, when um, when the United States went to the World Trade Organization and argued this position, the World Trade Organization actually agreed with the United States, and therefore, the United States decided to institute a tariff, and they instituted what's called a scientific tariff to protect U.S. steel industry and to create a competitive position, but really also to block Chinese steel from coming to the United States. So let's see what they ended up doing and how they reacted.
These increases here, these taxes, I mean, is this basically an all-out ban on foreign imports here?
Well, in the case of the Chinese companies with the 260% tariff, I mean, that's obviously prohibitive.
Yeah.
Effectively, those exporters won't be able to access the U.S. market. And it's when you consider that the 260% tariff we saw put out yesterday is actually added on top of a over 200% tariff we saw applied in November. We're getting close to 500% tariff, 5 times the cost of a steel import. I mean, absolutely astronomical. So for those exporters, yeah, absolutely.
So you can see again, the United States got a verification from the World Trade Organization that it appeared that China was dumping steel into our market, and therefore they instituted a 256% tariff on all Chinese steel, which essentially locked out China from our markets, from selling steel in our markets. And essentially, after that, China then became frustrated, of course, and angry. And this is what happens in this trade war that occurs after you start taxing and placing tariffs on products. And it's not just the tariff and placing the tariff that caused the problem. It was the initial dumping of low cost product into another market that really initiated the whole trade war. And so, what did China do? They then responded with what's called a retaliation. So they took a look at other industries in China that we were selling product into China from the United States, and they made a choice to initiate a tariff of their own.
The U.S. is challenging China over chicken. The United States will challenge China's high tariffs on chicken imports, making its case at the World Trade Organization. The U.S. says China is violating global trade rules and has maintained high duties on American exports, despite a WTO report almost 3 years ago that found those tariffs were in violation. Nearly 18% of poultry farmed in the U.S. is exported. The WTO action against China will mark the 12th complaint brought by the Obama administration against China at the WTO. And that's news on the street.
So again, you can see what's happening here, right? Back and forth, the United States and China continue to have essentially a trade war. And the main problem underlying all of this is Chinese manipulation, or actually the belief that they're manipulating their monetary system and their monetary value, which drives the cost of their products down in overseas markets, and makes it very difficult for anyone to compete against them. So that really is the underlying reason for a lot of these trade wars we continuously get involved with China. But you can see how this plays out. There are other arguments for trade restrictions, subsidies, for instance. So if what a subsidy is it's basically a financial benefit of some kind that a government is providing to a local producer so that they can compete more effectively in overseas markets. It's a way of giving, essentially giving a producer an unfair advantage in the export markets. So what ends up happening is, let's say, China is giving cell phone manufacturers in China some sort of a financial benefit or subsidy to export their product overseas, and that makes their product much lower in cost. Therefore, when it comes into the United States market, the United States charges them a tariff in response to the subsidy of an equal or greater value of the subsidy, increasing their price accordingly. That's called a countervailing duty. And that's happening all the time. Happens both to United States products being exported overseas and products being exported into the United States. There are also there's two different types of barriers. There are tariff barriers, which we've talked a little bit about tariff barriers, and there are non-tariff barriers. Some other tariff barriers include official prices. So this sets the price of all products that come into a market in a certain industry and says you must sell your product at this price regardless of what you can sell it for. That's a really kind of unhealthy position to take, because then it eliminates all competitive situations, and it really makes all products cost more in a market because no one's incentivized to cut costs. It eliminates the whole market concept, and it really harms consumers. Variable levies and lower duties for more local input also are means of barriers. Now there are several non-tariff barriers. So these are barriers that don't involve money. They don't involve charging money or putting taxes on anything. And these are other forms of discrimination against imports. Quotas, for instance, saying, hey, we're only going to take in our country 100,000 tons of soybeans from China. And that's a quota. Now, there are different types of quotas. There are absolute quotas, global quotas, and allocated quotas, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. Voluntary export restraints, orderly market arrangements, and non-quantitative, non-tariff barriers. So an absolute quota is when a specific quantity of imports is reached, those imports are prohibited for the rest of the period. Okay, and global and allocated quotas also are described here if you'd like to learn more about those. Voluntary export restraints are when a country voluntarily restrains their exports into a market because they know that they're going to get hit with a tariff or a quota anyways. So instead of giving into any kind of quotas, they just simply say, hey, listen, we promise only to export into your market a certain amount of our product. and they voluntarily offer that to the benefit of the relationship of the other country. And orderly marketing arrangements. You can learn more about that in the text. Non-quantitative barriers, including direct government participation in trade, like government subsidies, government procurement policies, where they restrict the purchase of imported goods by government agencies. Essentially, you can't buy anything unless it's local, Mr. Government. Any buying that you do as a government is done only locally, so that's a limitation. Forcing local content, so saying everything that's sold in our country must have at least 50% local content, like the Buy America Act, for instance. These things are direct government, non-quantitative, non-tariff barriers. Customs and other administrative procedures can be very complicated. So if you make it more complicated for folks from a different country who are trying to import your product into your market, that is an administrative procedure that slows down importing into another country. And then setting high standards that essentially don't allow for health and safety, things like that, but that are unreasonable standards. Not reasonable standards like, hey, we don't want you to accidentally get all of our people sick, or, oh, you're not supposed to have lead on those toys. Those are kind of reasonable standards, but there are lots of unreasonable standards, like all your labels must have 27 different languages on them, or there's all kinds of other not labels. There's all kinds of other standards that have made it difficult. In fact, I believe there's quite a few in the textbook. You could read more about the standards established at other countries that make it difficult to sell product in those countries unless you're from those countries. The bottom line here is that barriers to trade cost consumers a lot of money. When you start thinking about additional tariffs and how tariffs increase prices, slowing down product, eliminating competition, this all basically falls directly on the shoulders of the consumer. And essentially what ends up happening, because of all of these barriers to trade across the entire world, the global community of trade, the result is that consumers pay about 7 times the annual compensation of workers to save jobs, and they're paying much more than they actually have to in markets where product is protected from competition. And that harms consumers, and it makes it difficult for them to basically to buy things effectively. So now it's your turn. You're going to want to start making sure that you get your business plan done. I hope you're all working on that. And I wish you the best this week as you continue to make progress on your big business plan. Thank you.